The board members laughed as they prepared to strip the blind heiress of her entire inheritance, thinking she was helpless. But the room went silent when she caught a scent she hadn't smelled in 20 years. It was her brother's signature sandalwood cologne, and it was coming from the janitor. She did not scream. She did not fall. She simply lifted her chin half an inch, the way a person does when the whole world tilts and they refuse to let it show. Because Ryu Seol-a had learned a long time ago that the ones who wanted to break her were always watching her face for the crack, so she gave them nothing. She gave them stillness. She gave them the small, terrifying smile of a woman who has just heard a ghost breathe. And somewhere behind the long glass table, a man in a gray janitor's uniform tightened his grip on a mop handle until his knuckles went white because he had just watched a blind woman turn her head and look directly at him, as if she knew. As if, after 20 years of being dead to the world, someone had finally, impossibly, smelled him alive. Stay with me, because this is the story of how a scent brought a family back from the grave. And I promise you, it is going to break your heart in the very best way before it puts it back together. Before we go any further, if you believe that the people the world overlooks are the ones with the most to teach us, do me a small kindness. Tap subscribe. Hit the bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a heart in the comments if you've ever recognized someone you love before you could even see their face. Type it for me. I remember. Just those 2 words. I'll be reading them all the way through. Now, let me take you back to the room where it began. The cold room, the glass room, the room they built to make a young woman feel small. They did not tell her the meeting had been moved up 2 hours. That was the first cruelty, and it was a small one. The kind of cruelty that people who are comfortable being cruel don't even notice themselves committing. They moved the vote to 9 in the morning and simply forgot on purpose to inform the one person the vote was about. So Seoul arrived at 11, dressed in charcoal wool and quiet dignity, her white cane folding neatly into her palm. And she walked into a boardroom on the 40th floor of Seoul Tower that had already begun deciding her future without her. She heard it before she reached the door. Not the words, the temperature. Rooms have a temperature that has nothing to do with the thermostat, and this one was cold in the way of people who have agreed on something shameful and are pleased with themselves for it. "There she is," said a voice, "warm on the surface, rotten underneath. Seoul-a, sweetheart, we were just talking about you." Gyu Byung-tak, chairman of the board of Seoul Group, her late father's oldest friend and right hand. Or so the story went. The children had grown up calling him Uncle Byung-tak. The man who had stood at her father's funeral with his hand on her shoulder and promised, in front of 300 mourners, that he would look after her as if she were his own. He had kept that promise the way a wolf keeps watch over a lamb. "I'm not your sweetheart, Director Gu," Seoul said, and she said it pleasantly, because she had learned that pleasantness unnerved men like him far more than anger ever could. "And I believe the meeting was called for 11. My assistant confirmed it twice." "Was it? Must have been a mix-up." She heard the shrug in his voice. She heard, too, the small ripple of amusement travel around the table 9 other board members, each of them a signature away from a fortune that was not theirs. Here is the thing you need to understand about Ryu Seol-a. She had been blind since she was 11 years old, the same year she lost everything else. And in the 20 years since, she had not spent one single day being helpless. The world liked to imagine that blindness was a kind of darkness, a locked room, a smallness. For Seoul, it was the opposite. Losing her sight had cracked the world wide open and let everything else pour in. She could hear a lie in the half-second pause before an answer. She could hear the difference between a smile that was real and a smile that was worn. She could smell rain an hour before it came, and fear on a man's skin, and the particular sourness of a person who has decided to do a bad thing and is halfway convinced they deserve to. There was something else the old guard of that boardroom had never let her forget, either that she was only half a Ryu. Her mother had been a Nigerian woman named Ihuoma, brought home to Seoul by a chairman who married for love against his whole family's wishes. To the men around that table, Seoul-a and her brother had always been a footnote to be managed. The chairman's half-foreign children, too dark, too different, never quite real heirs to a Korean empire. They had underestimated her from the day she was born. They were about to learn how expensive that habit had become. She could smell all of that in the room right now. What she could not yet smell, what was still folded away, in a future only minutes from arriving, was the one scent that would tear her whole life open a second time. But we're not there yet. Stay with me. Let's just get on with it, said another voice, Director Pio, sharp and clipped. A woman who had never once said Seoul-a's name without making it sound like an inconvenience. We've all read the proposal. The group can no longer be responsibly managed by a controlling shareholder who is, forgive me, unable to physically review the documents she's signing. It's a liability. For her own protection, control passes to the board. For her own protection. Seoul-a almost laughed. They always said that. Every cage in the history of the world had been built by someone insisting it was for the bird's own good. You want me to sign away control of my father's company, Seoul-a said slowly, for my own protection. Voting control. Gu corrected smoothly. You keep your dividends, of course. You keep the house. You'll want for nothing. You simply won't be burdened with decisions you're not equipped to make. Not equipped. She felt her stomach drop half an inch, not from doubt, from memory. Because she had heard that phrase before, in this same voice, a very long time ago, on the worst night of her childhood. And she filed that away, the way she filed everything away, in the vast, dark library of a mind that never forgot a single sound. And if I don't sign? She asked. Then we're forced to petition the court for a guardianship. Director Pio said, and there it was, the blade under the silk, which is public and unpleasant, and which, given your condition, we would almost certainly win. Silence. The good kind of silence for them. The kind where a trap has closed and everyone can hear it. What they did not know, what nobody in that room knew, was that Ryu Seol-a was not afraid of the dark. She had lived in it for 20 years. She had made a home in it. And a woman who is not afraid of the dark is the single most dangerous person you can put in a room full of people who are— Bring me the papers, Seoul-a said quietly. And Gu Byung-tak smiled, she heard it, the wet little stretch of it, and slid a fortune across a glass table toward a blind woman he believed had already lost. That was the moment the door opened. That was the moment the janitor walked in. And that was the moment everything began to come apart. He came in with a bucket and a mop, and an apology already folded into his shoulders. Sorry, so sorry there was a spill in the corridor. They said it was urgent. I'll be 2 minutes. A janitor, nothing more. The board barely registered him. He was the kind of man the world had trained itself not to see. Gray uniform, gray cap pulled low, head down. Moving along the edges of a room the way water moves along the edge of a floor. Finding the low places, the ignored places, the places no one important ever looks. Gu waved a hand without looking. Fine, fine. Just be quick about it. The man knelt near the far end of the table and began to work. And Seoul-a, who had turned her face politely toward the papers she could not read, felt something move through the air. It reached her the way all important things reached her now. Not through her eyes, through the older doors, the animal doors, the ones evolution built before it ever built sight. Sandalwood, and underneath it spiced citrus. A thread of bergamot, though not quite right, a little too sharp, the orange cruder than she remembered, the whole blend rougher, as though someone had rebuilt it from cheaper oils and a very good memory. But the bones of it, the sandalwood at the heart, were unmistakable. Because the original of this scent was not sold in any store she knew of. It had never been sold in a store at all. It had been mixed by hand, in a tiny perfume stall in a Lagos market, by an old man with oil-stained fingers, for one specific customer, as a gift. She knew this because she had been there. She had been 9 years old, on the last golden trip the whole family ever took to her mother's city, standing on a low stool, her small hand in her mother's, watching her older brother, 13, gangly, grinning, insufferable, beloved, lean over the counter and pretend to be a sophisticated gentleman, while the old perfumer, Baba Ajani, laughed and dabbed different attar oils on strips of paper. "This one," her brother had said finally. "This is the one. This is going to be my smell, forever, so that even when I'm old and boring, Soma will always know it's me." And he had crouched down to her eye level. She still had her eyes, then, and dabbed a single drop on her wrist, and said, "There, now you'll never lose me. Just follow your nose home." Kang-jae. Her brother's name was Kang-jae, and Kang-jae had been dead for 20 years. Now I need you to understand what happened inside Ryu Seol-a in the next 4 seconds, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. The grief hit first. It always did. 20 years and it still arrived like the very first hour, a physical thing, a fist closing around the lungs. Because that scent was the last thing she had of him, and of their mother, and of the warm city where the two of them had chosen it together. She had spent a fortune, quietly, over the years, trying to track that formula down, keeping one precious bottle in a drawer she opened maybe once a year, on his birthday, just to remember that he had been real. That she'd had a brother. That once, before the dark, before the funerals, before the lawyers, she had been a little girl with a big brother who promised she'd never lose him. So her first thought was the kind the mind offers to protect itself. She was imagining it. Grief had finally conjured a ghost out of thin air. Some cheap department store scent had brushed an old wound, and her memory had done the rest. But Seoul-a did not live by sight, she lived by detail. And the details were all wrong for a coincidence, and all wrong for a stranger. Because you could not buy this scent, it had never been for sale, so no one could have splashed it on by accident that morning, or picked it off a shelf. And yet here, it was not fresh, not deliberate, but old on him, worn in, layered into the very fabric of a uniform that had clearly been used for years, and it was imperfect. Rebuilt from the wrong ingredients, the proportions a fraction off the work of someone who no longer had the perfumer or the money, only the memory. Only the exact, private knowledge of what the scent was supposed to be. And there was precisely one person alive who carried that knowledge in his bones. One boy who had stood at that Lagos counter and chosen these notes himself, at 13, and promised his little sister she would never lose him. So that even when I'm old and boring, Soma will always know it's me. Seoul-a turned her head, slowly, toward the man on his knees at the end of the table. And for the first time in 20 years, in a room full of people who thought she couldn't see a thing, Ryu Seol-a looked directly at someone. The mop stopped moving. She heard it stop. She heard a breath catch a man's breath, caught and held. She heard the small, wet sound of a hand tightening on a wooden handle. And in that held breath, in that frozen 4 seconds, two people who had been told the other was gone forever recognized each other across a room neither of them was supposed to survive. "Is there a problem?" Gu's voice, irritated, slicing in. Seoul-a turned her face back to the table, smooth as still water. "No," she said. "No problem at all. I thought I smelled smoke. It's nothing." A lie. Her first move on a board she was only now realizing she'd been playing on for 20 years without knowing the game had never ended. "I've changed my mind," she said, and she pushed the papers gently back across the glass. "I won't be signing today." The temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees. "Seoul-a," Gu began, warning creeping into the warmth. "I'd like to read them properly first. There are services for that, a person who reads them aloud to me. You wouldn't want me signing something I didn't understand, would you, Director Gu? For my own protection." She gave him his own knife back, handle first, and smiled. And across the room, very quietly, so quietly that only a woman who had spent 20 years learning to hear everything could have caught it, the janitor exhaled a single, shaking breath that sounded like it had been held for 2 decades. They did not tell her, when she was 11, how her brother really disappeared. "Let me take you back, because you cannot understand what Seoul-a did next unless you understand the wound she was walking on. The Ryu family had been, once, the kind of happy that doesn't know it's fragile. A father, Ryu Seol-a, who built a company from a single warehouse into an empire that stretched across Seoul. A mother, Ihuoma, from Lagos, with a laugh like a struck bell, who had married into a cold Korean dynasty and warmed it whether it liked her or not. Two children, Kang-jae, older, reckless, golden, and Seoul-a, younger, watchful, adored. They lived in a big walled house with a garden, and in that garden, near the back wall, grew a small, stubborn tree that had somehow rooted itself in a crack in the concrete of the old service path. Everyone said it would die. It had no business growing there. There was no soil, only a seam in the stone. And every spring, the tough little tree bloomed anyway. Kang-jae loved that tree. Their mother had shown it to them. "That's us," he told Seoul-a once, repeating what Ihuoma always said. "Han kids, we bloom anyway. Doesn't matter where they plant us. Doesn't matter what they think we are." Their mother died of illness when Seoul-a was 8, the first grief, the one that taught the children how to hold each other. All they had left of her, in the end, was that tree, that saying, and a sandalwood scent from her city that a 13-year-old boy had claimed as his own. Then came the night that split what remained of her life in two. She was 11, it was late. She remembered she would always remember a sound in the garden. Voices. Her brother's voice, first sharp, then afraid. She had gone to the window. And here the memory turned cruel, because what happened next took her sight and her brother in the same hour. There had been a struggle. A car. Men she didn't know. And her father's oldest friend standing at the edge of it all. She had seen him. She was sure she had seen him. A tall figure by the garden gate, and then someone had seen her at the window. And there had been shouting, and she had run, and on the stairs in the dark she had fallen, badly, her head against the stone. When she woke in the hospital 3 days later, two things were true that had not been true before. Kang-jae was gone, and she would never see again. They told her Kang-jae had been taken by kidnappers, that a ransom had been demanded, that her father had paid it, paid everything, anything, and that the kidnappers had taken the money and, weeks later, sent proof that the boy was dead. No body was ever found. Sometimes, the gentle adults said, there is no body to find. Her father was never the same. He aged a decade in a year. He poured himself into the company because the company was the only thing that would still let him pretend he had control over anything. And at his side, through all of it, steady, indispensable, endlessly kind, was his oldest friend. The man who helped him negotiate the ransom. The man who handled the police. The man who, when her father finally died of a heart broken in every sense, was named to lead the board that would protect the surviving Ryu child. Gu Byung-tak. Seoul-a had spent 20 years grateful to that man, and she had spent 4 seconds this morning beginning to understand that she had been grateful to the wrong man for the wrong reason for her entire adult life. Because not equipped to make decisions. She had heard that phrase before. She knew now where. It had drifted up the stairs the night her brother vanished, in a low voice by the garden gate. A voice saying something about a boy who was not equipped. A boy who would ruin everything. A boy who had to be dealt with before he was old enough to take control of what his father had built. At 11, she had not understood it. At 31, kneeling in the ruins of that memory, she understood it perfectly. Kang-jae had not been kidnapped by strangers. Kang-jae had been in the way. Stay with me. Because the blind heiress they laughed at is about to become the most dangerous person in that building. And the janitor with the sandalwood cologne is about to find out that the little sister he thought he'd lost had been listening in the dark for 20 years and had never once stopped following her nose home. Let me stop here for one breath, because I don't want you to miss what just happened. A blind woman, cornered by 10 people who wanted everything she had, was handed a pen and told to sign away her life. And instead, because of a cent, because of a promise made in a Lagos market 20 years ago, she just quietly refused, protected the stranger on his knees, and began pulling on the loose thread of the biggest lie of her life. If your heart is pounding, you're exactly where I need you to be. Do me a favor, type "bloom" anyway in the comments right now, so I know you're still walking this road with me. And if you haven't yet, subscribe, because what she does next is the part I've been dying to tell you. Now, let's follow her into the dark. It's where she does her best work. Seoul-a did not go home. She told her driver she had a headache and asked to sit a while in the small private lounge on the 10th floor, the one nobody used, the one her father had kept as a quiet room. And when the driver had gone, she stood up, unfolded her cane, and walked back out into a building she knew better than anyone alive suspected. Here's a thing the sighted forget. Seoul-a had walked the halls of Seoram Tower for 20 years with her hand trailing the walls, her ears mapping the echoes, her nose cataloging every floor by its particular smell, the machine oil of the sublevels, the burnt coffee of the trading floor, the lilies in the lobby that she hated because they smelled like her father's funeral. She did not need light. She had never needed light. In the dark, on her own turf, Ryu Seol-a moved like she owned the place, because she did. She went looking for the service corridors. Janitorial staff, she knew, moved through the building's hidden arteries, the gray corridors behind the polished ones, the freight elevators, the supply rooms that smelled of bleach and cardboard. She followed the smell of them. And underneath the bleach, faint but unmistakable, a thread of sandalwood led her forward like a rope in the dark. She found him in a supply room on the 3rd floor. She knew he was there before she opened the door. She could hear him breathing too fast, too shallow, the breathing of a man who has been sitting in the dark trying to decide whether the thing that just happened to him was real. "You can stop hiding now," Seoul-a said softly, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "I already found you. I found you the moment you walked into that room." Silence. Then a voice rough, careful, a grown man's voice with the ghost of a boy underneath it. "Ma'am, I think you have me confused with—" "Don't." She said it gently, but it stopped him cold. "Please don't. I have been lied to for 20 years by people far better at it than you. Don't add your voice to theirs. I couldn't bear it from you." She took a step toward him. She lifted her hand, not to grab, just to reach. The way you reach in the dark for something you're afraid isn't there. "You are wearing a scent," she said, and her voice finally cracked, just once, right down the middle, "that you cannot buy. Not in any store, not for any money you had." The original was mixed by hand, once, by an old man named Baba Ajani in a perfume stall in a Lagos market. Sandalwood, bergamot, a little bitter orange. And what's on you now isn't his. It's rougher, cheaper, made by someone working from nothing but memory. But it's the same recipe. The exact same recipe. Because you chose those notes when you were 13 years old, standing at his counter, and you told a little girl on a stool that she would never lose you, that she should just follow her nose home. She heard him make a sound, a terrible sound, the sound of a wall coming down. "So I did," Seoul-a whispered. "I followed my nose home. It took me 20 years. But I did it, Kang-jae. I found you. I found you." And the man who had spent 2 decades being no one, a gray man in a gray uniform in the gray corridors of a building owned by the family that had been stolen from him, finally, quietly, broke. "Soma," Kang-jae said. And then he was on his knees again, but not to clean anything this time, and she was down there with him on the cold floor of a supply room. And a brother and sister who had each spent 20 years grieving the other, held on as if the whole world were a current, trying to pull them apart again. When at last they pulled apart, she reached up and touched his collar, his sleeve, the places where the scent lived strongest. "You made this," she said. It was not a question. He gave a wet, broken laugh. "I couldn't afford Baba Ajani," he said. "I couldn't afford anything. But I remembered every note. I mixed it in bathroom sinks with the cheapest oils I could find, in every city they dumped me in, for 20 years. His voice failed him. I told you once, you could always follow your nose home. And then I couldn't come home, I'd have gotten you killed. So I did the only thing I had left. I kept wearing it. Every single day. So that if you ever got close enough, just once, you would know me before anyone could stop you. I thought you were dead, she kept saying. They told me you were dead. There was proof. Dad paid the ransom. And they said, I know what they said. His voice was wrecked. I've known for years. I've watched you, Soma. From the corners, from the service halls. I got a job here 2 years ago just to be near you, and I could never say anything, because if they knew I was alive. Who, Kang-jae? Who? And her brother went very still. And when he said the name, it was the same name she had already begun to hate. Gu Byung-tak. They sat on the floor of that supply room for an hour, and Kang-jae told her the story that had been rotting inside him for 20 years. I'll tell it to you the way he told it to her, quiet and steady and clean. Because some horrors don't need decoration. He had been 13. Old enough, that spring, to have started sitting in on things their father had begun bringing him along, teaching him the business, saying, one day this is all going to be yours, son, and you need to understand every inch of it. And Kang-jae, being 13 and clever and unable to keep his mouth shut, had noticed something. Money was leaving the company, quietly, through contracts that led to companies that led, if you followed them far enough, with a 13-year-old's stubborn curiosity, back to one man. Gu Byung-tak. Kang-jae had told his father he thought Uncle Byung-tak was stealing. His father had laughed and ruffled his hair and said Myung-soo was family, that Kang-jae had a wild imagination, that this was why he needed to learn the business properly before he went accusing people. But Kang-jae hadn't let it go. He'd kept a notebook, a stupid, brave 13-year-old's notebook, full of numbers and company names, and Gu Byung-tak had found out. He didn't plan to hurt me, Kang-jae said. I don't think. Not at first. I think he just wanted me gone. Out of the picture until he could clean things up. He had men take me. The plan was to hold me, demand a ransom, take the money, and disappear me somewhere far away. A boy who runs off, a tragedy, a ransom gone wrong. It happens. He had spent his teenage years in a locked room in another country. Then, when he was old enough to be a problem again, he'd been put on a boat, then a bus, then simply set loose, penniless, in a city where no one knew his name, with a warning that if he ever surfaced, if he ever contacted his family, they would finish what they'd started, and they'd start with his little sister. That's why I never came home, Kang-jae said, and his voice broke again. Not because I didn't want to. Every single day I wanted to. But he told me if I ever showed my face, he'd hurt you. You'd already lost your eyes. We'd already lost Mum and Dad. And I believed he'd take you too. So I disappeared. I let the whole world think I was dead to keep you alive. He stopped. I heard about your eyes. I heard you fell that night, running, because of me. It was not because of you. Seoul-a took his face in her hands. She could not see it. She traced it instead the jaw she remembered. Wider now, older, rough with stubble. The nose their mother used to call the Ryu nose. A scar above one eyebrow that had not been there when he was 13. She read her brother like a page. None of it was because of you. It was because of him. Every bit of it. My eyes. Dad's heart. 20 years of my life spent thanking a monster for his kindness. All of it. Him. She sat back on her heels. And I want you to notice the exact moment the grief in Ryu Seol-a turned into something else. Something colder and clearer and far more useful. He's going to try again, she said slowly. Today, tomorrow, soon. He's forcing the vote because he wants total control before what? Kang-jae. Why now, after 20 years? What's changed? And Kang-jae, who had spent 2 years pushing a mop through every corner of that building and hearing every conversation that important people have when they think the help can't hear. Kang-jae told her the last piece. Because Dad's old will has a clause, he said. I heard the lawyers. On your 32nd birthday, that's in 9 days, Soma, full control of the family's shares passes to you automatically, blind or not, no board, no conditions. Dad put it there. I think at the end he suspected something. I think it was the last thing he could do to protect you. 9 days. That's why Gu's panicking. He has 9 days to take it all, or he loses it forever, and if the books ever get opened by someone who actually looks, he goes to prison. Seoul-a finished softly. For 20 years of theft. And for a boy, he made disappear. For a boy he made disappear, Kang-jae agreed. Seoul-a stood. She unfolded her cane. And when she spoke again, the tremor was gone from her voice. And what replaced it was something that made even her brother sit up straight. 9 days, she said. He thinks I'm a helpless blind girl he can rush into signing. He has no idea what I've become in the dark. So here is what we're going to do, big brother, she smiled. We're going to let him win, right up until the very last second. And then we're going to give him back everything he gave us with interest. They had 9 days. They used every hour of them. Here is what most people get wrong about a blind woman. They assume the things she cannot do define her. But Seoul-a had spent 20 years building a life around the things she could do better than anyone: remember, listen, notice, wait. And she had one more advantage nobody had ever thought to take away from her, because nobody had ever thought she'd use it. Everyone talked in front of her. For 20 years, board members and lawyers and executives had spoken freely in Seoul-a's presence, because on some animal level they had stopped believing she was fully in the room. She was furniture. She was the blind girl, the half-foreign one. And so, over the years, without even trying, Seoul-a had absorbed an ocean of information: who was sleeping with whom, who was in debt, who hated Gu Byung-tak and was too afraid to say so, which lawyer had a conscience, and which one had a mortgage. Now she went through that ocean like a woman diving for pearls. First, she needed proof. Kang-jae's memory of a name on a company was not enough. Suspicion was not enough. She needed the numbers, the same numbers a 13-year-old boy had once scribbled in a notebook that cost him his childhood. So she went to the one person in that building she trusted, and it was not a person anyone would have expected. His name was Mr. Yeom. He was the night archivist, the man who managed the company's physical records in the basement, a quiet, precise man 3 years from retirement whom the board treated like part of the shelving. Mr. Yeom had read documents aloud to Seoul-a for years, in the quiet room, when she wanted to understand things properly. The board had always found this charmingly harmless. Let the blind girl feel involved. Mr. Yeom had never once found it harmless. Mr. Yeom had always understood exactly what Ryu Seol-a was doing. I always wondered, Mr. Yeom told her, on the second night, when she finally asked him for the old contracts, the ones from 20 years ago, the ones nobody had requested since, whether you'd ever come asking for these. I kept them, you know. When they told me to shred the old files, I shredded the copies. I kept the originals. I don't know why. I think I just didn't trust the man who gave the order. Gu Byung-tak gave the order, Seoul-a said. Gu Byung-tak gave the order, Mr. Yeom agreed. And he began, in his careful, unhurried voice, to read her 20 years of theft, line by line, into the dark. It was all there: shell companies, fake vendors, money bleeding out of Seoram Group and pooling, if you followed it far enough, in accounts that belonged to Gu Byung-tak. The very same pattern a 13-year-old boy had spotted with nothing but curiosity and a notebook. Kang-jae had been right. Kang-jae had always been right, and it had cost him everything. But here is the thing about paper. Paper proves theft. Paper does not prove what was done to a boy in a garden 20 years ago. And Seoul-a did not just want the company back, she wanted all of it. She wanted the world to know what Gu Byung-tak had taken from her brother. For that, she needed him to say it, out loud. In front of witnesses. He'll never confess, Kang-jae said, when she laid it out. He's careful. He's been careful for 20 years. He's careful when he's winning, Seoul-a said. But I've listened to that man for 2 decades, Kang-jae. I know his tells. His voice climbs half a step when he's frightened. And there is exactly one thing on this earth that frightens Gu Byung-tak. She smiled. You. A dead boy who isn't dead. The one loose end he's spent 20 years believing he tied off. If he thinks that thread is about to unravel in public, at the worst possible moment he won't be careful. He'll panic. And panicking men say true things. So they built the trap. The automatic transfer of control would happen at the annual shareholders meeting, which, by a cruelty of scheduling that Seoul-a now saw as a gift, fell on her 32nd birthday. Gu had moved the vote to strip her control to that very morning, hours before the clause would trigger, so he could take everything in the narrow window before the law took it out of his hands. He wanted it public, too. A room full of shareholders watching the poor blind heiress responsibly hand over her burden. He wanted witnesses to his kindness. Seoul-a decided to give him his witnesses. Over the next days, quietly, she moved her pieces. She had Mr. Yom prepare certified copies of every document sealed, notarized, untouchable, and she had a second set placed with a lawyer outside the company entirely. One of the ones she'd long ago noted had a conscience. A woman named Chinelo Mabadiwe, who had left the firm years ago precisely because she wouldn't play Gu's games, and who, like Seoul-a's mother, carried Lagos in her voice. If anything happens to me before that meeting, Seoul-a told her, you open the envelope and you burn his whole world down. Chinelo, who had waited a long time to be handed exactly this, said only, it would be my genuine pleasure. She reached out, one by one, to the board members she knew were afraid, rather than corrupt the ones who had gone along with Gu out of cowardice, not malice. She did not threaten them. She simply let them understand, in careful conversations, that a reckoning was coming, and that there were 2 sides of it to be standing on, and that she was a forgiving woman to those who chose correctly and in time. And she arranged for 2 more guests to attend the shareholders' meeting. The first was a detective, not a company person, a real one, from the real police, who had reopened more than one cold case in her career and who listened to Seoul-a's story for 3 hours, without once interrupting, and then said, quietly, Miss Ryu, I have been doing this for 22 years, and I have never wanted to close a case as badly as I want to close this one. Tell me what you need me to do. The second guest was Kang-jae, not the janitor, not the gray man in the gray uniform. Ryu Kang-jae, in a suit, clean where it counted, bearded where he chose, standing straight for the first time in 20 years. Seoul-a had a tailor come to the quiet room and dress her brother like the heir he had been born to be, and when he was finished, Kang-jae looked at himself in a mirror he was almost afraid of, and Seoul-a, who could not see him, reached up and straightened his collar by feel and said, there, now you look like Dad. He wept. She held him. One more day, she whispered. You've been hiding for 20 years, big brother. Tomorrow you stop hiding. Tomorrow you walk into that room in the light, and you let them see you. And I promise you I will be right there. I can't see you do it, but I'll hear every second, and I'll be the proudest sister who ever lived. How do you do it, Soma? He asked her. How are you so calm? And Seoul-a thought about the tough little tree in the garden of a house they'd lost, the one their mother had loved, the one that had no business growing in a crack in the concrete, the one that bloomed anyway, every single spring. Because nobody had told it that it couldn't. Because they planted us in concrete, she said, and we're about to bloom right through it. The morning of her 32nd birthday, Ryu Seol-a walked into the great glass boardroom of Seorim Tower one last time, as a woman everyone in the building believed they had already beaten. The room was full. Shareholders in every chair, executives along the walls, the 10 board members arranged around the long glass table like a jury that had already reached its verdict. Gu Byung-tak sat at the head, and Seoul-a could smell his confidence from the doorway. Expensive cologne, expensive coffee, the particular ease of a man who believes the hardest part is behind him. Seoul-a. He rose, all warmth, all performance, for the benefit of the room. Come in, come in. Happy birthday, my dear. We'll try to make this quick and painless. Thank you, Director Gu, Seoul-a said sweetly, and let her driver guide her to her chair, and played, for a few minutes more, the part of the helpless girl. That's very kind. It has been such a comfort, all these years, knowing you were looking after me. Always, he said, and she heard him mean it as a joke, only he was in on. The formalities began. Papers were distributed. A lawyer, Gu's lawyer, stood and explained to the assembled shareholders, in gentle and regretful tones, that Miss Ryu had come to recognize the wisdom of transferring voting control of the family's shares to the experienced stewardship of the board, for her own protection. There was that phrase again. It went around the room like a lullaby. So if Miss Ryu will simply sign, the lawyer said, and Seoul-a heard the pen slide across the glass toward her, we can conclude this matter and move on to happier business. Seoul-a reached out. Her fingers found the pen. She picked it up. The room held its breath. Gu Byung-tak leaned forward, and his breathing was easy, and his voice, when he murmured, "Go ahead, dear," was low and warm and utterly certain. And Seoul-a set the pen down. "Before I sign," she said, and now she let her voice carry, let it fill the glass room to every corner. "I'd like to say a few words. It is my birthday. And it's the last time I'll sit in my father's chair. Surely you can indulge a blind girl a small speech." A ripple of indulgent, uneasy laughter. "Of course," Gu said, a half-step higher. There it was. The first crack. 20 years ago, Seoul-a began, I lost two things in a single night, my sight and my brother. The room went quiet in a different way now. You all know the story. Kang-jae was taken, a ransom was paid, and a 13-year-old boy was declared dead, though no body was ever found. My father grieved himself into an early grave, and through all of it, one man stood beside our family and helped us carry the unbearable. Isn't that right, Director Gu? I did what anyone would do, Gu said. Another half-step, for people I loved, for people you loved, Seoul-a repeated softly. I believed that. For 20 years, I believed that. Do you know what I used to do, Director Gu? On Kang-jae's birthday, I would open a drawer and take out a bottle of the cologne he used to wear, Sandalwood. He had it made when he was 13, in our mother's city. He told me, her voice caught, just once, and she let the whole room hear it, let them lean in. He told me that even if I ever lost him, I could always follow my nose home. She stood. 9 days ago, in this very building, I smelled that cologne again. And the temperature of the room dropped 10 degrees, and this time it was not Seoul-a who felt the trap close around her. It was Gu Byung-tak. That's a lovely sentiment, he said, and his voice climbed a full step now, and Seoul-a could hear his heartbeat in it. But I really think we should. Let her finish, said one of the board members, one of the frightened ones, one of the ones Seoul-a had spoken to in the dark. And around the table, others murmured agreement, and Gu Byung-tak felt, for the first time in 20 years, the ground move under him. I smelled my brother's cologne, Seoul-a said, because my brother was in the room. He has been in this building for 2 years, Director Gu, pushing a mop past your office, emptying your wastebasket, listening. You looked straight through him 100 times, because you never once imagined that the boy you tried to erase would come back and stand in the light. This is insane, Gu said, rising now, his chair scraping. She's ill. She's clearly unwell. Grief has... Kang-jae, Seoul-a said. Come home. And the door at the back of the boardroom opened. I want you to picture it, because Seoul-a could not, and she would spend the rest of her life having it described to her, and every time she would cry. A man in a dark suit walked into the room, tall, straight-backed, the Ryu nose, the scar above his eyebrow, and a face older, harder, but unmistakable to anyone who had known the father that made 3 of the oldest shareholders in the room gasp out loud, because it was like watching a dead man walk in from the hall. "Hello, Uncle Byung-tak," Ryu Kang-jae said quietly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." For one unguarded second, Gu Byung-tak made a sound that was not a word, and Seoul-a heard it, the involuntary crack of a man watching the impossible walk through a door. Then she heard him do the more frightening thing. She heard him swallow it, square his shoulders, and reach for calm. He had been careful for 20 years. He was not going to stop now. 20 years, Kang-jae said, walking slowly toward the head of the table. 20 years I did what you told me. I stayed gone. I stayed silent. Because you told me that if I ever came back, you'd hurt my sister. You'd already taken her eyes. You'd taken our father. And I believed you'd take her too. So I disappeared. I let the whole world think I was dead to keep her alive. He stopped. But you made one mistake, Director Gu. You got greedy. You couldn't just be rich. You had to have all of it. And you forced her hand 9 days before she'd get everything anyway, and it made you sloppy. And it brought me into that boardroom with a mop in my hand, and my sister, my brilliant, impossible sister, the one you called helpless, recognized me by my cologne from across a room she couldn't even see. You have no proof of anything, Gu said, and Seoul-a heard him reach for the old smooth voice, the one that had fooled a room for 20 years. A janitor, a blind woman, a story. That's not evidence, Seoul-a. That's grief. I don't need them to believe me, Seoul-a said. That's why I didn't bring a story. I brought a ledger. And Mr. Yom, the night archivist, stood up from a chair by the wall where nobody had noticed him because nobody ever noticed him, and he opened a folder, and in his careful, unhurried voice, he began to read. Shell companies, fake vendors, 20 years of money bleeding out of Seoram Group into the accounts of Gu Byung-tak, the same numbers a 13-year-old boy had written in a notebook. Read aloud now, at last, into the light, in front of every shareholder Gu Byung-tak had ever lied to. The color Kang-jae told her later drained out of the man's face line by line. You stole from my father while you buried his son, Seoul-a said. You held a boy in a locked room for years. You put him on a boat. You threatened a child's life to keep a man silent for 2 decades. And you did all of it, Director Gu, while telling the world you were protecting us. She turned her face toward him, unerring, and the whole room watched a blind woman find her enemy in the dark. I'm not going to ask you to confess. You're too careful for that, and we both know it. I only want you to answer one thing honestly, the way you never could when my father was alive. She tilted her head. Did he ever suspect you? Or did you let your best friend die believing his son ran away? And here is where 20 years of listening paid for itself. Because she had not given him a crime to deny. She had given him a chance to be, one last time, the smartest man in the room. And Gu Byung-tak, who had spent 20 years being exactly that, and could not, even now, resist proving it, let something cold and satisfied slip into his voice. Your father, he said quietly, was a sentimental fool. He built an empire and wanted to hand it to a 13-year-old half-breed who kept a Times notebook. A thin, contemptuous breath. I didn't have a choice, Seoul-a. Kang-jae made the choice for both of us the day he decided to count my money. I only made sure the number came out right. The room had gone completely silent, too silent, and Gu Byung-tak a beat too late heard it. You're right, Seoul-a said softly. You didn't confess to anything. She let the silence stretch. You just told a room full of witnesses that my brother was alive to make a choice when 9 days ago you swore to a judge he'd been dead for 20 years. She tilted her head. The recorder on the table got the rest. And the detective who had been sitting quietly in the 3rd row, not a company person, a real one, stood up and took out her badge. And the great glass room that Gu Byung-tak had built to make a blind woman feel small became the room where the whole world finally saw him clearly. They did not tell her, 20 years ago, that the story would end like this. No one did. For most of those years, no one believed it could. Gu Byung-tak was arrested in that boardroom, in front of every person whose respect he had spent a lifetime buying. The paper trail Mr. Yom had refused to shred sent him to prison for the theft. The words he could not resist saying in front of 100 witnesses, a detective, and a recording device Seoul-a had made very sure was running, sent him there for what he'd done to Kang-jae. He never confessed. He simply couldn't stop being the smartest man in the room, and the smartest man in the room had just contradicted his own sworn statement on the record. He would be an old man before he saw daylight again, if he ever did. The board members who had been merely cowards kept their freedom and lost their seats. The ones who had been more than cowards followed Gu into the dark. And the family's controlling stake in CRM Group, all of it, every share, every acre, every one their father had built, passed, on the morning of her 32nd birthday, exactly as their father had quietly arranged from beyond the grave, into the hands of his 2 children, both of them, together, because the first thing Seoul-a did, once the dust settled, was tear up the story that had killed her brother. She stood before the shareholders and told them the truth, that Ryu Kang-jae was alive, that he was the rightful heir alongside her, and that from that day forward CRM Group would be run by both Ryu children, the sister who saw everything without her eyes, and the brother who had come home from the dead. The half-foreign children the old guard had never counted as real. Nobody in that room would ever make that mistake again. The old shareholders wept, the young ones cheered, and a company that had been quietly rotting from the inside for 20 years began, that very day, to heal. But that is not the ending I want to leave you with. Because empires and boardrooms were never really what this story was about. Some months later, on a bright spring morning, Seoul-a and Kang-jae went back to the old house, the one they'd grown up in, the one that had been sold off in the grief years, which Kang-jae had quietly bought back the moment he could. They walked into the garden together, her hand in the crook of his arm, and Kang-jae led his sister to the back wall, to the old service path. "It's still here," he said, and she heard the wonder in his voice, the 13-year-old still living somewhere inside the man. Soma, the tree, it's still here. It's huge now. It grew right up through the concrete. Seoul-a knelt down. She found the seam in the stone with her fingers, the old crack where nothing was ever supposed to grow, and she followed the trunk up with her hands thick now, weathered, alive to where the branches spread out above her, heavy with blossom she would never see and did not need to. She could smell it. That was enough. It had always been enough. "Bloom anyway," she whispered their mother's words, in their mother's daughter's voice. "Bloom anyway," her brother agreed, and sat down beside her in the grass, and for a long while the two of them just breathed the blossoms, the green, and underneath it all, faint and familiar and finally safe, the warm sandalwood scent of a promise that had taken 20 years to keep. He had told her she would never lose him, that she could always follow her nose home. And she had. All the way home. If this story broke your heart in the best way, and then put it back together, tell me. Drop a heart in the comments. Type, "I remember," if you made it all the way here with me. And, "Bloom anyway," if you needed to hear that today. Somebody watching this needed that reminder more than you know. That the people the world overlooks, the ones they underestimate, the ones they try to plant in concrete, those are exactly the ones who bloom right through it. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay close. Because next time, I'm going to tell you the story of the daughter everyone forgot at her own mother's funeral until a stranger stood up in the back and called her by a name only her real family was ever supposed to know. You won't want to miss who that stranger turns out to be. Until then, love the people around you out loud. You never know how much time you'll have to follow your way back to them. I'll see you in the next one.